Karl Porter gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned his Oldsmobile Cutlass onto South Main Street. January 1982 brought a peculiar kind of cold to Akron. Not the bracing chill that filled your lungs with winter vigor, but the hollow kind that seemed to reach inside your chest and twist something vital. His knuckles whitened against the dark vinyl as the Firestone plant came into view. For 32 years, he'd made this drive. For 32 years, the massive brick complex had represented everything solid in his universe. The world might shift and turn, presidents might come and go, wars might start and end, but the factory remained. Until now. He slowed the car, eyeing the bulletin board where HR posted announcements. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Something in Karl's stomach tightened, the half-digested remains of his breakfast turning to concrete. It's just another rumor, he muttered to himself, pulling into his usual spot. Been hearing the same damn thing since '75. But he knew better. Everyone did. The writing had been on the wall since Firestone had moved their headquarters to Chicago 5 years ago. Akron had always been the rubber capital of the world. That's what they'd taught him in school, what his father had told him when he first took him to see the enormous factories belching steam and smoke into the Ohio sky. 5 major companies: Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone, General, and Uniroyal. Backbone of the city. Backbone of America. Now the spine was crumbling. Karl's false belief wasn't that the factories would stay forever. He wasn't stupid. It was that he, Karl Porter, mattered to them. That 32 years of showing up, of never missing a shift, of loyalty that ran bone deep, meant something. He believed that there was an unspoken contract. Give your life to the company, and the company would take care of you. Porter. Owen Richards was standing by the bulletin board, arms crossed over his chest. They'd started on the same day in 1950, fresh-faced 20-year-olds with the Korean War looming. Neither had been drafted. Instead, they'd built tires that went onto military vehicles, feeling patriotic with every rubber compound they mixed. What's the word? Karl asked, already knowing. It's official. They're shutting us down. April 3rd. Owen's voice was flat, the kind of flatness that comes after the shock has hit and left you hollowed out. 1,100 jobs. Gone. Karl's first thought was practical. 3 months. That's not enough time to figure out what comes next. His second thought came with a wave of nausea. What comes next? The air smelled of rubber and chemicals, the same scent that had permeated his clothes, his hair, his skin for over 3 decades. He'd come to associate that smell with security. With purpose. Goddamn Japanese, muttered someone in the crowd, flooding the market with their cheap tires. But Karl knew better. He'd seen the new machinery installed in the Goodyear plant across town last year. Automated systems that could do in minutes what took skilled workers hours. He'd seen the men in suits taking notes, timing operations, studying movements. Radial tires had changed everything. The old bias ply technology that Karl knew like the back of his hand was becoming obsolete. Meeting in the cafeteria at 9, Owen said. Management's gonna explain the severance packages. Severance. The word itself felt like a blade. To be severed. Cut off. The day passed in a fog. Karl went through the motions, checking gauges, adjusting settings, inspecting materials. His body knew what to do without his mind's input. Muscle memory built over a lifetime. Around him, men talked in hushed tones or angry outbursts. Some wept openly. One man punched a wall and was sent to the infirmary with bleeding knuckles. Karl said nothing. The cold feeling in his chest expanded until it seemed to fill his entire torso. At 5 o'clock, he punched his time card, the satisfying chunk of the machine that had punctuated his days since he was 20 years old, and walked to his car. He sat there for a long time, staring at the factory's outline against the darkening sky. What do I tell Olivia? He whispered to the empty car. Olivia Richards, Owen's daughter. They'd been married 28 years. She'd been 17 when they met at a company picnic, her yellow dress bright against the green park lawn. Karl had been 23 and already established at the plant. He'd felt such pride introducing himself as a Firestone man. The way her father had sized him up, nodding with approval at Karl's firm handshake and steady job. The security he could provide. He drove home slowly, rehearsing words that wouldn't come. Their house on Brown Street was one of many nearly identical homes built for factory workers in the 1940s. Small but sturdy, with a narrow front porch and aluminum siding they'd upgraded to in 1973. The mortgage was nearly paid off, one of the few blessings in this mess. Karl, Olivia called as he stepped through the door. Her voice came from the kitchen, where the smell of pot roast filled the air. Wednesday was always pot roast. The regularity of their life had been its foundation. "You're late. Everything okay at work?" He set his lunch pail down and hung his coat on the hook by the door. His movements were mechanical, buying seconds before he had to answer. "No," he said finally, his voice strange in his ears. "Everything's not okay." The pot roast went cold on the table as he explained. Olivia's face went through a transformation he'd never witnessed before. Concern to shock to fear to something harder, something that looked like determination. "We'll figure it out," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We've got savings. The house is almost paid for. You've got skills." But what skills? He'd operated the same machines for decades. His hands were skilled at tasks the world no longer needed. That night, he couldn't sleep. Olivia's breathing eventually steadied beside him, but Karl stared at the ceiling, watching headlights occasionally sweep across it as cars passed on the street. The next 3 months unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. There were meetings about pension plans that wouldn't cover half of what they needed. Career counseling sessions that felt like cruel jokes, as if a 52-year-old rubber worker could simply become something else. The younger men talked about moving to Texas, where the oil industry was booming. Others mentioned the remaining plants. General Tire was still operating, and Goodyear hadn't completely shut down yet. But everyone knew. This wasn't just Firestone. This was the beginning of the end for Akron Rubber. Karl applied for positions at the other plants, but they were flooded with applications from men just like him. By March, he was waking at night in cold sweats, the same dream replaying, standing at the factory gate, watching it being bricked up while he still stood outside in his work clothes, suddenly invisible to everyone passing by. On April 3, 1982, Karl Porter worked his final shift at the Firestone plant in Akron, Ohio. The machines ran slower that day, as if they too were mourning. Men who hadn't spoken to each other in years embraced. Photographs were taken. Someone had made a banner, "Thank you for 82 years," hanging awkwardly in the cafeteria. Karl ran his hand over the mixer he'd operated for the last 15 years. The metal was warm under his palm, vibrating slightly with life. He knew every sound it made, could diagnose any problem from the slightest change in its hum. This knowledge, accumulated over decades, would die with the factory. At the end of the shift, no whistle blew. The machines were shut down one by one, the enormous factory growing quieter until an unnatural silence filled the space. Karl punched his time card one final time and slipped it into his pocket instead of the rack. A small act of theft that felt like salvaging a piece of his identity. In the parking lot, men lingered, unwilling to make the final departure. Karl found himself standing with a group that included Owen and several others from his department. "Drinks at Ray's?" someone suggested. They filled the small bar 3 blocks from the plant. Men who had worked together for decades suddenly had nothing to talk about except the past. Their conversations circled around the same themes: anger at the company, fear of the future, memories of better times. "Remember when we made the millionth tire in '58? Owen was saying, his voice slurred after his 4th beer. "They shut down production and rolled it out for photographs. Had the mayor come and everything." Karl nodded, nursing his 2nd drink. The memory was clear, the pride they'd all felt, the sense of accomplishment. He'd been 30 years younger then, his future seemingly as solid as the brick walls of the factory. A younger man at the bar was getting louder, his anger spilling over. "My father worked there 40 years. 40 years. And what did he get? A gold watch and cancer from the chemicals. Now they're telling me I need to learn computers?" At 35, Karl felt the younger man's rage like a physical heat. But beneath it was something familiar, the same false belief Karl had carried. That loyalty would be rewarded, that hard work guaranteed security. He drove home carefully that night, the streets of Akron both familiar and suddenly alien. The city had grown around rubber. Now what would it become? Summer came, and with it, the humiliation of unemployment checks. Karl had never taken a handout in his life. Now he stood in line with others just like him, men whose identities had been built around providing, around producing. "School," Olivia suggested one night as they sat on the porch, watching lightning bugs rise from the lawn. "The government's offering those retraining programs." At my age, Karl shook his head. What am I going to learn that some kid out of high school doesn't already know better? But there was no work. Not in Akron, not for men like him. By August, Goodyear had announced another round of layoffs. General Tire was rumored to be next. The exodus had begun. U-Haul trucks packed with furniture and hopes, heading south or west. Karl watched his savings dwindle. He took odd jobs, fixing cars, repairing roofs, anything that would bring in cash. His hands, so skilled at specific tasks, adapted reluctantly to new demands. Every morning, he still woke at 4:30 a.m., his body clock set by decades of early shifts. He'd sit in the kitchen, drinking coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, the silence of unemployment roaring in his ears. The midpoint crisis came on a Tuesday in September. Karl had been helping a neighbor replace some rotten boards on his deck, a job that paid cash under the table. As he bent to pick up a discarded piece of lumber, something in his back gave way. The pain was instant and blinding. 3 days later, lying in bed with muscle relaxers barely touching the agony, Karl faced his new reality. His body, the tool he'd relied on his entire working life, was betraying him. Just like the company, just like the city, just like America itself. "We need to talk," Olivia said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her face had aged years in the past 6 months. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened. But there was something else there too, a resilience he'd never fully appreciated before. About what? His voice was flat. "My sister called from Cincinnati. The hospital where she works is hiring maintenance staff. It's not great money, but it's stable. Benefits too." She paused, then spoke the words Karl had been avoiding. "We need to consider moving. Leave Akron." The idea felt like surrender, like admitting that everything he'd built his life around had been an illusion. "What's keeping us here?" Olivia asked softly. "The house. We can sell it. Our friends? Half of them have already left." What was keeping him here? The ghost of what had been. The hope that somehow, magically, the factories would reopen, the jobs would return, and life would go back to what it had been. That night, as Olivia slept beside him, Karl faced the truth he'd been avoiding. The false belief at his core wasn't just that the company owed him loyalty. It was that his worth as a man was tied to this specific place, this specific role. That Karl Porter, Firestone man, was the only version of himself that had value. The dark night of the soul lasted through fall and into winter. Karl's back slowly healed, but something in his spirit remained broken. He watched as more neighbors left. The local grocery store closed. Then the hardware store. The church attendance dwindled. Akron was hollowing out from the inside. In December, they got the news that Owen had had a heart attack. Mild, the doctors said, but a warning. Karl visited him in the hospital, shocked by how small his friend looked in the white bed. "Cincinnati, huh?" Owen said when Olivia mentioned their considerations. "Not a bad move. Different, but not bad. You thinking of leaving too?" Karl asked. Owen looked out the hospital window at the gray Akron sky. "Melissa and I are talking Florida. Her brother's down there. Says there's construction jobs, building houses for all the retirees." He laughed weakly. "Never thought I'd be roofing houses at 53. "Never thought a lot of things," Karl replied. On the drive home, they passed the Firestone plant. It stood empty now, windows dark, parking lot cracked with weeds pushing through. A chain-link fence surrounded it, topped with barbed wire, as if the empty shell contained something worth stealing. "Stop the car," Karl said suddenly. Olivia pulled over, giving him a questioning look. Karl got out, walked to the fence, and gripped the cold metal with both hands. The factory had been his North Star, his anchor, his identity. Now it was just an abandoned building. "Goodbye," he whispered, not to the building but to the belief that had shaped his life. The belief that his value came from what he produced, from where he worked, from a system that had never actually guaranteed anything. The climactic choice came in January 1983, 1 year after the closure announcement. Karl stood in their living room, surrounded by boxes. The house had sold quickly to a developer who planned to convert it into rental units. The market was flooded with similar homes as families continued to leave. "Ready?" Olivia asked, car keys in hand. Karl looked around the empty room. 30 years of memories. The marks on the doorframe tracking their son's growth before he left for college. The dent in the wall from the time he'd thrown a baseball inside despite Olivia's warnings. The worn spot on the carpet where his armchair had stood. I'm not sure I know how to be anyone other than who I was here, he admitted, his voice rough. Olivia took his hand. You're still you. That didn't close down with the factory. They drove south that day, the U-Haul trailer bouncing behind their car. Karl watched Akron recede in the rearview mirror, the familiar skyline growing smaller until it disappeared entirely. The knot in his chest didn't loosen immediately. That would take time. Cincinnati was different. Bigger. More diverse. The hospital where Karl found work as a maintenance supervisor wasn't anything like the factory. There was no rhythm of production, no camaraderie of men who'd worked side by side for decades. But there was something else, a sense of being needed, of contributing. By 1990, Karl had been promoted twice. His knowledge of mechanical systems, his attention to detail, his work ethic, the same qualities that had made him valuable at Firestone, were assets in his new role. The irony wasn't lost on him. They bought a smaller house in a suburb north of Cincinnati, made new friends, found a new church. Life went on. In 1995, Karl and Olivia drove back to Akron for Owen's funeral. The heart attack that finally took him came suddenly, 13 years after the warning in the hospital. The city had changed so much Karl barely recognized parts of it. The old Firestone plant had been demolished, replaced by a shopping center. Only the old headquarters building remained, preserved as an historic landmark. After the service, Karl stood in the cemetery, looking out over the city spread below. It wasn't your fault, you know, said a voice beside him. Karl turned to find Owen's son Michael standing there, now a man in his 40s. What wasn't? Leaving. Dad used to say you were smart to go when you did. That staying was what killed so many of them. The ones who couldn't imagine being anything else. Karl nodded slowly. It wasn't easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Michael replied, echoing words Karl recognized as Owen's. Later that evening, in their hotel room, Karl stood at the window looking out at the Akron skyline. The familiar factory smokestacks were gone, replaced by new structures he didn't recognize. Penny for your thoughts, Olivia said, coming to stand beside him. Karl put his arm around her shoulders. I was just thinking about identity, about how I spent so many years believing I was nothing without that factory, without this city. And now, he considered the question. Now I know better. We're not what we make. We're not where we live. We're not even what we do. He turned to look at his wife, the lines on her face as familiar as his own heartbeat. We're who we become when everything we thought we knew falls apart. The transformation was complete. The false belief that his value was tied to his role as a factory worker, as an Akron man, as a producer, had been replaced by a deeper truth. Karl Porter had discovered that identity wasn't something given to you by a company or a city. It was something you built yourself, piece by piece, choice by choice, especially when everything familiar was stripped away. In 2002, 20 years after the closure, Karl returned to Akron one last time. He was retired now, his hair completely gray, his back permanently stooped from the injury that had never fully healed. The city had reinvented itself somewhat. The university had expanded, medical facilities had grown, some tech companies had moved in. But it would never again be the rubber capital of the world. He drove past their old house on Brown Street. It was an apartment building now, the siding replaced, the porch enclosed. He continued to South Main, where the shopping center stood on the site of the old plant. In a small park nearby, a memorial had been erected, a bronze statue of a rubber worker, lunch pail in hand, gazing forward. Karl stood before it, reading the plaque that honored the men and women who had built Akron, who had made it the rubber capital of the world from 1870 to 1980. A young woman was sketching the statue, her pencil moving quickly over a pad. My grandfather worked there, she said, noticing Karl's interest. 35 years at Firestone. Karl smiled. I put in 32 myself. Her eyes widened with interest. Really? What was it like? What was it like? How to explain the sensation of the floor vibrating beneath your feet, the smell of rubber compounds, the precise temperature of the mixers, the satisfaction of a perfect product, the security of knowing exactly who you were and what tomorrow would bring. It was a different world, Karl said finally. We thought it would last forever. She nodded, then hesitated. Do you miss it? Karl considered the question, looking at the statue's face, idealized, heroic, untouched by the complications of real life. I miss who we were, he said. The community. The certainty. He paused. But sometimes certainty is just another word for being stuck. The young woman tilted her head. That's an interesting way to look at it. It took me a long time to see it that way, Karl admitted. But that's what happens when things fall apart. You either break with them, or you find out what you're really made of. He touched the bronze figure's lunch pail, identical to the one he'd carried for decades, the one still sitting on a shelf in his Cincinnati garage. We were more than just rubber workers, he said softly. We just didn't know it until we couldn't be rubber workers anymore. The young woman nodded, adding something to her sketch. When she turned it toward him, Karl saw that she'd drawn him standing next to the statue. Two figures from different eras, facing different futures. Would you sign it? She asked, offering him her pencil. For my project, about how cities reinvent themselves. Karl took the pencil and carefully wrote his name below the drawing. Karl Porter, Firestone 1950 to 1982. He handed it back, then added, cities aren't the only things that reinvent themselves. People do too. Sometimes we just need a push. Driving back to Cincinnati that evening, Karl felt a sense of peace that had been decades in the making. The old factory was gone. The old certainties were gone. The old beliefs about what gave a man value were gone. But he remained. Changed, humbled, strengthened. A man who had survived the end of one world and found his place in another.